For 22 years, Marcus Kingsley had put men behind bars for believing they were above the law. He never imagined that a Tuesday afternoon at a car wash would test whether the law applied to the men enforcing it. The heat that August afternoon in Millbrook Falls sat thick and heavy, the kind that made the asphalt shimmer and turned every parking lot into a slow oven. Judge Marcus Kingsley, appointed to the federal bench 11 years earlier. The first black judge in the district's history, had exactly one afternoon a month that belonged entirely to him. And this was it. No clerks. No docket. No security detail trailing 2 cars back. The way protocol demanded, whenever he traveled outside the courthouse district, he'd left that detail behind on purpose. Marshal Diane Ochoa, who ran his protective unit, hated when he did it. And today was no exception. She'd texted him twice already, asking why his tracker showed him 17 miles outside his approved perimeter. He'd silenced his phone. He was 51 years old. And some days, a man just wanted to wash his own truck without an armed escort idling in the next lane. He drove an old maroon F-150. A truck he'd bought, used the year he made partner at his old firm. Long before the robe and the Senate confirmation hearing and the 24-hour detail that came with a lifetime appointment and the occasional threatening letter forwarded quietly by the Marshals service without comment. He wore what he always wore on these afternoons, a faded grey Morehouse College t-shirt, gone soft at the collar, basketball shorts, and flip-flops that had seen better decades. He looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like a man killing time on a slow Tuesday, which, in a sense, he was. The Suds and Shine on Route 9 was the kind of self-service car wash that hadn't changed its prices since the Clinton administration, 3 bays, a rattling vacuum station, and a faded mural of a cartoon soap bubble grinning down at the pavement. Marcus pulled into the second bay, fed the machine a stack of quarters, and lost himself in the simple, mindless satisfaction of running a soapy brush over 20 years of highway grime. The radio in his truck was still playing low, tuned to a jazz station out of the county seat. For 20 minutes. There was no docket, no clerks, no threats folder sitting unopened in his chambers. Just soap, water, and the particular piece of a task with a clear beginning and end. He didn't notice the patrol car until it was already idling at the entrance to the lot. Deputy Dale Whitcomb had been parked across the street at a gas station for the better part of an hour, working through his third energy drink and a mounting frustration that had nothing to do with the heat. There'd been a rash of catalytic converter thefts hitting car washes and self-serve lots across 3 counties, vehicles jacked up for 30 seconds while an owner ran inside for change. The converter gone before anyone noticed the noise. Whitcomb's captain wanted arrests. And Whitcomb, 34 years old and 14 years into a career that had stalled somewhere around permanent afternoon shift, wanted exactly one thing: to be the guy who finally made one. He'd built a private theory over the last 3 weeks. One he'd never said aloud to his sergeant because he suspected, correctly, that it would not survive being said aloud. The theory was simple: young men in gym clothes, driving trucks a little too old for the neighborhood, loitering a little too long near a vehicle's undercarriage. That was the profile. He'd watched enough dashcam compilations at the station to believe he had an eye for it. So when he saw an older model pickup with out-of-county plates, driven by a black man in gym clothes, who'd been parked in the same bay for nearly 15 minutes, doing what looked, from across the street, like fiddling around underneath his own vehicle, Whitcomb's instincts didn't ask a single follow-up question. He pulled the cruiser across the lot's exit, blocking it entirely, and stepped out, the door swinging shut behind him, with a heavy, "Deliberate thud, hands where I can see 'em." Whitcomb called, one palm already resting on his holster. Step away from the vehicle. Marcus straightened slowly, a soapy brush still in one hand, water dripping down his forearm and pooling at his feet. Afternoon. Officer, I'm just washing my truck. Is there a problem? We've had a run of converter thefts up and down this corridor. Whitcomb said, closing the distance fast. Boots slapping against wet concrete. You've been under that vehicle for a while. I haven't been under my vehicle, Marcus said evenly, setting the brush down on the ledge of the bay with the same deliberate care he'd have used, setting down a gavel. I've been washing the wheel wells. If you'd like, I can show you the receipt from the machine, the timestamp on my phone, or the actual condition of the exhaust system. Any of those would clear this up quickly. Don't move toward anything. Whitcomb's hand tightened on the holster's grip. You do. Now. Marcus considered. For half a second. Simply saying it, I'm a federal judge, and letting the sentence do the work it usually did in rooms full of strangers who recognized his name if not his face. But 22 years on the bench had taught him something about the particular danger of a man's ego once it had already reached a verdict. Announcing a title to someone who has decided you're beneath one rarely de-escalates. It usually just changes the shape of the humiliation. He decided, instead, to establish the record the way he always did in his own courtroom, carefully, methodically, and in a way that would hold up regardless of who was listening. My identification is in the glove box of my truck, Marcus said. Before I reach for it, I'd like to understand what specific, articulable suspicion you have to detain me. Have I been reported for anything? Or am I simply matching a general description? Whitcomb's jaw tightened. The vocabulary articulable suspicion landed on him the way it always landed on officers, unaccustomed to hearing it from someone they'd already decided didn't belong in this parking lot, let alone in possession of legal terminology. You're going to lecture me on reasonable suspicion in a car wash parking lot? I'm asking a question. Officer, turn around. Whitcomb's voice cracked louder now, drawing the attention of the lone attendant across the lot, a teenager named Cody, who'd stopped restocking the vacuum coin machine to stare, his phone half raised out of some instinct he couldn't fully explain even to himself later that evening. Hands on the hood, Marcus turned, slowly, and placed his palms flat against the warm, wet metal of his truck's hood. The metal had been baking in the August sun for 20 minutes. It burned faintly against his skin. I am complying, he said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear clearly. His voice pitched with the same clarity he used when reading a verdict aloud to a silent courtroom. I want it on the record that I have not been informed of a specific crime, and that I have offered my identification twice. Shut it, Whitcomb snapped, grabbing Marcus's wrist and wrenching it behind his back with more force than the moment called for. The second wrist followed, yanked up hard enough that Marcus felt something pull sharply in his shoulder. The cuffs clicked shut, biting into skin that had spent 2 decades signing court orders. Not wearing them. You people always got a speech ready, Whitcomb muttered, low enough that only Marcus could hear it. The words, carrying a specific, practiced contempt that suggested this was not the first time he'd used them. I'm not resisting, Marcus said, his voice steady, despite the sharp bite of metal at his wrists and the throbbing ache spreading through his shoulder. You are making a serious error. Officer Whitcomb, he'd read the name off the deputy's tag, filing it away with the same precision he'd once used, memorizing case citations, and I strongly advise you to check my identification before this goes any further. I'll check what I want, when I want, Whitcomb said, steering him toward the cruiser, with a hand clamped hard on his shoulder. Ignoring the wince that crossed Marcus's face, the back of the patrol car smelled like old vinyl and drive-through coffee. The plastic seat scalding hot, even through his shorts. Marcus sat with his wrists aching, watching through the wire mesh as Whitcomb walked back to the truck, popped the glove box, and rifled through it with an impatience that scattered a folded road map and an old parking receipt onto the passenger seat. He pulled out a slim leather case, expecting a driver's license. Instead, gold caught the afternoon sun, a federal seal, embossed cleanly into leather. And beneath it, in formal block letters, United States District Court Chambers of the Honorable Marcus A. Kingsley. Whitcomb stared at it for a long moment. The kind of moment where a man's stomach drops out from under him before his brain has finished processing why. He turned the case over once, as if the back might reveal it was a joke. A novelty item. Something explainable. It wasn't. He carried it back to the cruiser like it might be a trick, opened the driver's door, and held it up toward the rearview mirror so Marcus could see he'd found it. This is real. It is, Marcus said quietly, and I'd suggest you radio your dispatcher immediately. Deputy. Because that credential is registered with an automatic notification protocol through the U.S. Marshals Service. You have a very small window to correct this yourself before it corrects itself. Whitcomb didn't fully understand what that meant. Not yet. He climbed into the driver's seat. Radio mic in a trembling hand. His earlier bravado already curdling into something closer to dread. Dispatch. This is Unit 7. I've got a subject in custody at Suds and Shine on Route 9. Need a plate run and a name check. Kingsley. Marcus Kingsley. There was a pause on the line. The sound of a keyboard clattering somewhere in a dispatch office 20 miles away. Then the dispatcher's voice came back, and every trace of routine boredom had drained out of it. Unit 7 say, again your exact 10 to 20. No. That name just triggered a federal protective flag. I need you to confirm the subject's condition immediately. Whitcomb's hand tightened on the mic. He's in custody. Cuffed. What kind of flag? Stand by. The dispatcher said, and the line went dead for 6 of the longest seconds of Deputy Dale Whitcomb's career. What Whitcomb didn't know, because it had never once crossed the mind of a rural sheriff's deputy to ask, was that federal judges who'd received credible threats were assigned a protective detail through the U.S. Marshals Service. And that detail included a location transponder embedded in a judge's personal effects, designed to trigger an alert the moment its wearer deviated too far. For too long, from an approved route without checking in, Marcus had missed his check-in by nearly 40 minutes. Marshal Diane Ochoa had been trying to reach him since the second unanswered text, and had finally done what she always swore she wouldn't: quietly followed his last known route at a distance. Close enough to intervene. Far enough to give the judge the illusion of privacy he so stubbornly insisted on. Ad doi patruzeci și șapte M. An alert lit up on Ochoa's phone as she sat in her SUV 3 streets over. Protectee deviation. No check-in location. Suds and Shine. Route 9. She was moving before the second line of text finished loading. Radio already keyed to the Regional Marshals Service command post. This is Ochoa. I need eyes on Judge Kingsley's last transponder ping, and I need local law enforcement contact information for that jurisdiction. Right now. We have him, came the reply. Stationary at a car wash on Route 9 for the last 20 minutes. Wait, location just moved. He's in a vehicle. Not his own plates come back to the county sheriff's department. Ochoa's blood went cold. He's in a police car. Confirmed. Dispatch logs show a Deputy Whitcomb requesting a name check on the judge approximately 90 seconds ago. Get every available unit rolling, she said, already pulling out of her spot. Tires chirping against the hot asphalt. And patch me through to that dispatcher directly. I want confirmation. The judge is uninjured before I hang up this radio. Back in the cruiser. Whitcomb sat frozen. The radio silent in his hand. When 3 black SUVs and a pair of unmarked sedans came screaming around the corner in tight, disciplined formation, and boxed his patrol car in from every angle at once. Doors flew open before the vehicles had fully stopped. Federal agents in dark, tactical vests fanned out across the lot, several with weapons lowered but ready, moving with the calm precision of people who trained for exactly this and hoped never to need it. U.S. Marshals, step out of the vehicle with your hands visible. Whitcomb's hands shot up on instinct as he stumbled out of the driver's seat, the radio mic dropping and swinging on its cord. I'm a sheriff's deputy. Marshal Ochoa was already at the rear door, pulling it open, her expression tight with fury and relief in equal measure. Judge Kingsley, are you hurt? Sir, cramped. Diane, Marcus said, his voice dry despite everything, though the pain radiating through his shoulder made the joke cost him more than it showed. Otherwise fine. Ochoa's gaze snapped to Whitcomb, who stood frozen between two federal agents, hands still raised. Cuff him, she said flatly. Weapon, badge, radio, all of it. You can't just. Whitcomb started. I absolutely can, Ochoa said, already producing her own key and stepping behind Marcus to release his wrists. She winced at the deep red lines the metal had left behind, already darkening into bruises at the edges. Sir, I want this documented. All of it. Every second. So do I, Marcus said, rubbing his wrists slowly as blood returned to his fingers in a sharp, unpleasant rush. I want the body camera footage preserved, unedited, before anyone in that department has the chance to think twice about it. And I want the dispatch audio pulled before end of shift. By the time Sheriff Owen Bell arrived at his own station 40 minutes later, summoned out of a lunch meeting by a call, he would remember for the rest of his career, federal agents were already inside. His own front desk officer, pale and silent behind the counter, his dispatcher visibly shaking as she typed up an incident log under the watchful eye of a marshal she'd never met. You had a sitting federal judge in cuffs in the back of one of your cruisers for over 20 minutes. The lead investigator told him, without preamble, standing in the doorway of Bell's own office, as though the sheriff were now the visitor in it. And your deputy never once checked his identification before making that stop personal. Bell had no answer. His department had spent the better part of 2 years quietly building a reputation for aggressive, proactive policing along that stretch of Route 9, a phrase that, under federal review, was already starting to look a great deal like a euphemism for something far less defensible. He thought, in that first sickening moment, not of Whitcomb, but of the department's own internal metrics, the stop logs he'd praised at 3 separate town council meetings, the numbers that had always looked, to him, like diligence, and were about to look, to everyone else, like something else entirely. Whitcomb was placed on unpaid leave within the hour, pending termination. He sat in the break room afterward, staring at a vending machine, unable to meet the eyes of the 2 agents assigned to escort him out of the building. By evening, the department's dash and body camera footage had been reviewed by 3 separate parties: the federal marshals, the state attorney general's civil rights division, and at Marcus's own insistence, over the objections of Ochoa, who worried about the optics of speed. A reporter from the regional paper granted access under strict chain of custody terms. The footage was unambiguous. A man standing calmly with his hands raised, twice offering identification before he was ever cuffed. A deputy who invented a justification for the stop after the fact, one that didn't match any actual dispatch alert about converter thefts that day. Whitcomb, it turned out, had never actually received a bulletin naming that make or model of vehicle at all. He had built the justification retroactively, the way a man builds a bridge after he's already fallen into the river. That detail, the fabricated justification, confirmed by a records request, the very next morning was what turned a bad stop into a criminal referral. By Thursday, the county district attorney's office had opened a formal inquiry into Whitcomb's stop history going back 3 years. And the numbers, once pulled, told their own uncomfortable story. A pattern of stops concentrated overwhelmingly on black and Hispanic drivers along a 5-mile stretch of Route 9. A pattern no supervisor had ever flagged. Because no supervisor had ever been asked to look, the story did not stay contained to Millbrook Falls for long. By Wednesday morning, a grainy cell phone video shot by Cody, the car wash attendant, who'd captured the last 30 seconds of the arrest before Whitcomb noticed him and ordered him to put the phone away, had made its way onto social media. Stripped of context, but unmistakable in its content, a black man in gym clothes, hands raised, being forced against the hood of his own truck. Local news picked it up first. By Wednesday evening, it had become a story. 2 cable networks were leading with, though neither yet had the name of the man in the video. Only a caption, "Local officials investigating viral arrest video in Millbrook Falls." Marcus watched a segment of it, muted, in his own living room that night, and felt the particular vertigo of seeing himself reduced to a blurry figure in someone else's footage. Stripped of his name, his robe, his 22 years on the bench reduced entirely to the clothes he happened to be wearing. By Thursday morning, the name had leaked, and the story changed shape entirely. It was no longer a viral video about an unnamed man. It was a national story about a sitting federal judge. The county's police union released a statement within hours, careful and defensive in its phrasing. Deputy Whitcomb was responding to an active pattern of property crime in the area and followed standard procedure in securing the scene pending identification. It did not mention that identification had been offered twice before the cuffs were applied. It did not mention the fabricated bulletin. Marcus read the statement in his chambers the next morning, seated behind the same desk where he'd once read far more consequential documents with far less personal stake in their outcome, and felt something colder than anger settle over him, the specific, familiar cold of watching a system attempt, in real time, to protect itself. Marcus did not hold a press conference. He was not, by nature, a man who sought cameras, and Ochoa had gently suggested twice that a public statement from him personally might complicate an ongoing investigation more than it clarified anything. He listened to her. He usually did, but 3 days after the arrest, opening a scheduled session of his own courtroom for an unrelated civil matter, he set aside the morning's docket for exactly 2 minutes to address something he felt could not go unspoken. Standing at the same bench where he'd delivered 1,000 rulings, with considerably less at stake for himself, personally. "Before we begin today's proceedings," he said, his voice steady, his wrists still faintly marked beneath the dark sleeve of his robe, "I want to say something briefly. On the record, because I believe silence in this particular case would be its own kind of statement, and not the one I intend to make." The courtroom, which had been shuffling papers and murmuring quietly a moment before, went still. 3 days ago, I was detained and handcuffed at a car wash by a deputy who had already decided, before he asked me a single question, exactly who I was. He was wrong, but I want to be precise about something, because precision is the only thing this bench has ever asked of anyone who stands before it. The danger here was never that he happened to be wrong about me specifically. I have resources most people in his custody that day would not have had. I have a badge in my glove box that carries weight. Most citizens' identification never will. The danger is a system that permits an officer to reach that conclusion about anyone based on nothing more than a t-shirt, a truck, and an assumption without a single moment of consequence, and without a single supervisor ever asking why the numbers looked the way they looked. He let the silence in the courtroom sit for a moment before continuing, his gaze moving briefly across the gallery, resting nowhere. In particular, I intend to refer this matter, and the broader pattern uncovered in that department's records, to the appropriate oversight bodies. and I will recuse myself from any matter in which it might reasonably be perceived to affect my judgment. I raise it today. In this room, for one reason, only because of what happens. Quietly, every day, to people who don't carry a federal seal in their glove compartment and a protective detail 3 streets away when the cameras aren't rolling and no one happens to be filming. He nodded once, briskly, the way he always did when closing a matter. We'll proceed with today's docket. The courtroom did not erupt into applause. It was not that kind of room. And Marcus would not have wanted it to be, but the silence that followed carried a different weight than the one that had preceded it. And reporters in the gallery were already typing before he'd finished his sentence. Within a month, the fallout had moved well past Deputy Dale Whitcomb himself. The State Attorney General's office, having reviewed 3 years of the department's stop data at Marcus's formal request, submitted not as a judge demanding favor, but as a private citizen filing a public records request like anyone else, could have found what investigators later described as a systemic and sustained pattern of disproportionate stops along the Route 9 corridor, concentrated overwhelmingly on Black and Hispanic drivers. With almost no corresponding rate of the crimes those stops were nominally intended to address, the Sheriff's Department entered into a court-monitored reform agreement, mandatory body camera audits reviewed quarterly by an independent board, a citizen oversight committee with subpoena power over use of force incidents, and a full retraining of the patrol division on stop justification and documentation standards. Deputy Dale Whitcomb was formally terminated and indicted on charges of falsifying a police report and violating the civil rights of a citizen under color of law. He would eventually plead guilty to the lesser charge, accepting a sentence that ended his career in law enforcement permanently. Sheriff Owen Bell, facing a wave of public scrutiny he had never anticipated and clearly had no appetite to weather, announced in September that he would not seek re-election. Marcus kept the old F-150. He still drives it out to the suds and shine on the second Tuesday of every month. Still feeds the machine the same stack of quarters. Still tunes the radio to the same jazz station out of the county seat. The only thing that's changed is small, and mostly invisible to anyone watching. Marshal Ochoa parks in the lot directly across the street now, instead of 3 blocks over, and neither of them argues about it anymore. Some afternoons, Cody, the car wash attendant, whose 30 seconds of unsteady cell phone footage had done more to change the department's culture than a decade of internal memos waves from behind the vacuum station. And Marcus waves back, and for 20 minutes, there is nothing more complicated in the world than soap, water, and the particular piece of a task with a clear beginning and end